When I was a little kid, my dad used to take my brothers and I on short backpacking treks in and around the Texas Hill Country, and it was these memories that shaped a deep love in my heart for the outdoors. Something about getting away from all the chaos that surrounds us on a daily basis, it was amazing, and this is still something that's extremely important to me to this day. Unsurprisingly, after graduating from college, I applied for a job in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. Nearly all of my time there was dedicated to educating individuals of all ages what the world looks like right on the edge of treeline, and I loved my job. On a daily basis, I was picking up new skills and sharpening my understanding and respect for the great outdoors. After spending nearly half a year living 8,000 feet above sea level, we had a 2-week break from work, and I decided to take the opportunity to get a hold of my brother and 2 of our closest buddies from high school with a proposition: a backpacking adventure in the San Juan Mountains. And much to my excitement, everyone was on board. A few weeks later, after some preliminary back and forth and a longer than expected trek across the state to the Denver airport, our merry little band of adventurers was united and ready for the journey ahead. Because our group was fairly diverse when it came to backpacking experience, our plan was a modest one. Wake up early, finalize the packing, and head for the trailhead with the hopes of making good time on the roughly 5-mile trek to where we planned to set up our base camp, a beautiful little spot called Crystal Lake. Now, I am well aware that 5 miles is not really that crazy, especially for the more experienced backpackers out there, but something I should probably mention is the fact that 90% of the trail leading up to Crystal Lake is a pretty serious incline. Nothing crazy, mind you, but you do gain well over 3,000 feet of elevation in roughly 5 miles, so needless to say, when we finally arrived at the lake, we were all pretty tired. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the beautiful weather we had been enjoying decided to take a leave of absence, and thankfully our small tents graciously ushered us in while we waited for things to calm down outside. A few hours later, we gathered around a freshly made fire and began to hash out a plan. Crystal Peak is one of the many mountaintops in the San Juan region, and it's actually one of the most prominent peaks visible when entering Lake City from the south. It really is beautiful. But there's one thing about it that seems to turn interest in another direction. It's actually not the only mountain in Colorado with the name Crystal. Plus, it's just shy of 13,000 feet, which means it's the shorter of the two, and therefore on many hiking sites it's listed as Crystal Peak B. Now, I am in no way speaking for all hiking enthusiasts, but in my experience, I have heard quite a few echoes of, while bigger isn't always better, it certainly doesn't hurt. So, unfortunately, Crystal Peak B has kind of gotten the raw end of the deal here. There isn't even a specific route to the top, so when our group made the decision to make our way up, we proudly pinned our Trailblazer badges to our rapidly inflating egos and started off. I'm sure y'all have already noticed this, but Crystal Peak is basically a giant ramp with some pretty steep cliffs on either side, so coming up with a game plan wasn't really that difficult. Find a way to get on the ramp and walk to the very top. Well, turns out that wasn't going to be as simple as we had originally thought. Our initial approach turned out to be way steeper than we had realized, so we pretty much just started walking along the ridgeline, hoping it would smooth out enough for us to walk up. Luckily, it eventually did, but this slight miscalculation set us back quite a bit, and there was a lot of very steep ground to cover and not a lot of daylight. Oh yeah, and if you're watching this video and thinking that's the top, not even close. This was the first lip of several we had to get over. There was lip number 2, lip number 3, and by the time I was looking up at lip number 4, I legitimately wanted to curl up and die. After taking a brief moment to reflect on why in the world I put myself in these situations, I took a deep breath, put my head down, and started walking. A few minutes later, now, I've been at the top of quite a few 14ers and even a few 13ers, but there's something about the view from the top of Crystal Peak that still resonates with me to this very day. It was gorgeous up there, and I think what made it even better was the fact that it wasn't this super popular mountain to climb, which meant we were now a part of a small group of individuals who know what Crystal Peak looks like from the top. After snapping some pictures, it was starting to get cold and dark, and considering the fact that there wasn't a trail leading us down, there was definitely an urgency to get back to our camp. We started the decline, and almost immediately there was a bit of a problem. Our group was a little torn over whether or not to return the way we came or try to find a shorter route. And after some brief discussion, we decided to try and split the difference. We would begin the original route and then exit the ramp roughly half a mile earlier. At first, everything was going really well. But once we veered off the ramp, after about a quarter of a mile, our plan started to fall apart a bit. The thick cloud coverage meant there was barely any moonlight, so it was quite a bit darker than it typically would be at nighttime in the mountains. Because of this, what we thought was a steep grassy slope ended up being a very steep talus slope, which definitely changed things. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a talus slope is, or a scree, depending on how particular you want to be, what I'm talking about is basically a massive collection of small to medium-sized jagged rocks spread out across a slope, and this concept by itself is precarious. But if you come across one of these that's steep enough and made up of mostly loose rocks, it can be a recipe for disaster in the daytime. What made our situation especially frustrating was that we had no idea where the end of this thing even was. I mean, we knew things had to smooth out eventually, but we were flying blind for the most part. Our field of vision was limited to little more than the spotlight created from our headlamps. As we slowly, and I mean very slowly, made our way down, after about 15 minutes, we hit yet another roadblock. We had somehow come to the edge of a massive cliff. I remember calling back to my brother, who was 80 or so yards behind us at the time, and letting him know that we unfortunately had to double back a bit. And if I recall, he responded with, "Yeah, whatever, man." At least that's how I remember it. We were all exhausted, frustrated, and just ready to get back to camp. We doubled back and started down the slope at a different spot, and after about 30 minutes, things actually started looking up for us. The moon was now slightly peering out from behind the clouds, and we could finally see what we were pretty certain was the bottom. One of the guys was actually able to get ahead of our group by quite a bit, and when he finally arrived at our freshly established finish line, I remember seeing the beam of light from his headlamp exploring the ground in all directions, and that's when I shouted out, "Hey, what do you see down there? Give us the good news." What followed is etched into my brain with so much clarity, it's surreal. There was a long pause, and then, "PJ, it's just more rocks everywhere." Some of y'all might be able to relate to this, but occasionally there are circumstances that push you to the very limit emotionally, physically, or mentally. And in my experience, you go into survival mode and everything kind of zones out in a way, and you just become this walking container of determination and adrenaline. Truth be told, I don't really remember all that much after my friend informed us we weren't done with the insanity by a long shot. I just remember things getting really quiet, putting my head down and focusing on what was directly in front of me, and an unknown amount of time later, we were all back in our base camp. I have no idea how long the process took or what time it even was when we got back to camp, but I can say it felt like a freaking eternity. The next morning, first thing in our agenda, get a good hard look at what in the world we climbed down the night before, and when we finally walked up on it, it did not disappoint. I'm quite certain most of y'all have a pretty decent grasp on perception differences, especially when it comes to mountain photography, but for clarification's sake, we're standing on a hill quite a bit closer to the camera, and some of those larger rocks down below were actually bigger than we were. This thing was a monster, and to this day I can't believe we completely avoided it on our way up and got stuck smack dab in the middle of it on our way down. To make a long story short, it was a much needed slice of humble pie when it came to my mountain man maneuvering abilities, and it was hands down the wildest thing that ever happened to me while in Colorado. Okay, that's not true necessarily, but that is a story for another time. Oh, okay, so we made it to the top all in one piece. We're on the descent now, but it looks like there is a storm rolling in, a little quick. Good stuff.